Well, we'll just jump in. Thank you everyone for being here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Madeline Jett. I'm Executive Director at Associate Artists of Pittsburgh. Associate Artists of Pittsburgh, or AAP for short, is an organization that exhibit, promotes, and supports the work of Pittsburgh-based artists. We have to take a moment and thank our supporters, specifically the Heinz Endowments, the Pittsburgh Foundation, the Allegheny Regional Asset District, the Hillman Foundation, and the Buell Foundation. I'd love to thank my staff. I can't do anything without them. Jamie's here manning the AAP Zoom, as well as our board, our donors, and other supporters. And finally, I always have to thank our members, two of whom I'm going to hand over hosting duties to and let you all, both of you, discuss a wonderful exhibition we have on view right now in our space down in Lawrenceville. We are at 143rd Street, Nice House Studios, and tomorrow is the last day to catch the show. It is gorgeous. And without further ado, I turn it over to you, Ben and Hannah.
Oh, wow. Hey, Madeline, thanks a lot. So my name is Ben Schonberger, and I am a visual artist and educator in Pittsburgh, and Hannah and I were asked to sort of develop a dialogue about her work in the exhibition. So I have a series of questions for Hannah. I'm going to introduce Hannah. Hannah's going to show some work, and then Hannah and I are going to have a conversation about the work, and then we want to open this up to the group and hear what people have to say, what people's thoughts are. Again, the exhibition is up. A permanent home in the mouth of the sun is up until tomorrow. So if you haven't seen it, get to the gallery. But I'd like to introduce you, Hannah, and turn it over to you to look at some images. So Hannah Altman is a Jewish American artist from New Jersey. She holds an MFA from Virginia Commonwealth University. Her photographs interpret relationships between gestures, the body, lineage, and interior spaces. She has recently exhibited with the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art, Blue Sky Gallery, Filter Photo, and Photoville Festival. Her work has been featured in publications such as Vanity Fair, Carnegie Mellon, Museum of Art, Storyboard, Huffington Post, New York Times, Photo Room, Cosmopolitan, ID, and the British Journal of Photography. She was included in the Silver Eye Center for Photography's 2021 Silver List and received the 2021 Lens Culture Critics' Choice Award. Hannah, we're so happy to have you with us tonight.
Oh my gosh, I'm so happy to be here, and thank you so much to AAP and Ben. I lived in Pittsburgh for a long time and did my undergrad at Point Park University, so Pittsburgh holds a really special place in my heart. And Ben was one of my former professors, so I am just happy to be in the same Zoom room as him. But I'm gonna share a little intro to my work. I'm gonna share my screen before we get to some questions from both Ben and the audience here. So can you guys see my screen okay? Okay, perfect. So at the time that A Permanent Home in the Mouth of the Sun started to manifest in its current form, by the way, I love when people forget the name and stumble on it. It's such a mouthful. It's like a metal album. But at the time that this work had started to manifest, I had just moved to Richmond for my MFA at VCU, but I was traveling home to New Jersey when I could. My grandma had died a few months beforehand, and so my family was spending a lot of time clearing out closets, and we were finding a true mishmash of an archive. It was everything from these incredible handwritten memoirs describing my grandma's time as a Holocaust refugee seeking asylum in Cuba before America's borders were open. And there were also notes directly on top of it that seemingly described nothing. Possible descriptions of gifts, objects that don't exist anymore. And then there are also a ton of photographs. There are photographs of her as a child and after she immigrated to the US and changed her name. And then with my mom as a child, with my mom pregnant with me, and onward in this jumbled mess. And I was really drawn to these findings and started documenting them, not necessarily as photographs, but mostly as research, and sort of letting them pull me in these various different directions as I got more and more into the project. And notably amongst this material, there was a lot of Judaica, Hebrew necklaces, Kiddush cups, artwork, that sort of thing. And I've always been a portrait photographer, so instead of just photographing these objects as objects, I pretty immediately started using these objects in photographs that involved the body in some capacity. Like in these images here, using Shabbat candles and a Hebrew necklace, really as a form of just like going through this archive and healing and sharing. And it felt good. It felt like I had a very limited connection to Jewishness growing up. And so going through these things felt like an active connection to my past, but also to my future at the same time, and also to my present. It felt very all-encompassing and immersive. And there's a Jewish idea of collective memory. It's the idea that all Jews share a past through repeating stories and performing rituals and passing down heirlooms. And I started thinking more about these inheritances and how, you know, they expand beyond my immediate bloodline and start to contribute to this idea of collective memory. And as I began thinking about what kind of forms this sense of memory that spans generations, the work started to flow past my own immediate family and sort of into this stream of collective community. So I started thinking about this work at a few different intersections, thinking about Jewish ritual, thinking about the way that we interpret them and perform them, and thinking about the ways that using Judaica, using Jewish objects in imagery can start to further ideas of collective memory as this like photographic link on a very long chain. And so for this reason, I wanted to push further than photographing an object or a ritual or a story in this like purely dioramic, I guess, fashion. And so I wanted the rituals to become more activated and contextualized into the spaces that they were being photographed in. And so I started at sometimes incorporating, but at other times just completely ignoring historical connotations of these objects, these like allegorical connotations of stories. You know, like thinking about how honey is used as a symbol for sweet beginnings. We just had the Jewish New Year where this is I'm so sick of honey right now because I've been eating it all week. But how that connotation might change around closed fists. And similarly, thinking about a woman wrapping tefillin, it's historically a male mitzvah, and thinking about, you know, not only that, but how the light in her world around her can mimic these like shapes of the leather straps. It starts to, this way of thinking starts to extend a symbol past an object, past its physicality. And I think that thinking this way has been really fruitful because I find that they start to reclaim stories of their own as images. And in this way, it's as much about the ritual as it is about the translation of the ritual. And so, you know, photographs in this project in this way are not only thinking about and addressing historical significance, ancestral significance of certain actions and such, but using them really as a source, a root, a springboard really to initiate present day stories. And I'm really interested in this, you know, opportunity for varying commentary, especially as it regards, you know, the idea of a story itself, the structure of a story itself, because there are so many interpretations of folklore. And so Jewish thought in this context kind of proposes that varying interpretation of a story is as significant to perpetuate and understand and think about as an actual story itself. And it starts to pose this question of asking what Jewish narrative looks like and what constitutes a Jewish image, because it thinking about Jewish text and tradition, we think about narrative, we think about history, we think about memory. These are subjects around which we revolve and obsess. We talk about beginnings and we talk about diaspora and we talk about persecution. And it's essential to memorialize history by carrying it again and again through this sort of like yearly ritual repetition of stories and traditions. And so I was thinking about these retellings when I made these images, you know, like a mother and a daughter sharing both this concrete gaze, sharing the weight of their recurring history that their bodies carry. And similarly to the right, like thinking about reflections and repetitions and thinking about how there is still very much Jewish symbolism in formal portraits like this, because they're propped up on themes of Jewish folklore. There's no Judaica to point to per se, because rather it is the world that they are immersed in, the world that they inhabit, and also the outlook through which we view them from, especially within the context of this project. And so similarly, I've been thinking about this Yiddish word that comes from a primarily pre-World War II. It exists, but I think it's very different now. But it's a pre-World War II socialist Jewish movement called the Bund. And the word is Doikait, which is a concept of here-ness, of solving challenges confronting Jews in the space in which we live. And I come back to this idea often in this work, mainly because to me, this idea of here-ness is this commitment to engage in time where we stand, wherever that is. And I think we can better prioritize storytelling and ritual this way, especially in photos. And so in this sense, these images are, they're encapsulating that here-ness. They don't exist in this like fictional ahistorical vacuum, they're grounded in real life and they carry all the complexities that come with Jewish identity. But they deepen their purpose and they orient their bodies in such a way that they're rooted in materiality, but they reach towards this more immaterial light. And so thinking about this, I started exploring the idea that in both my photographic work and within Jewish storytelling, using the body as a tool that can be centralized and used in Jewish action really opens up this sense of memory that's not fixed in time or space, and it kind of just floats. And therefore participates in collective memory because it exists everywhere. It exists as an immersive thing. It exists as something that floats above. And I think that's really interesting to me. This enhancement of this body centers the body and it emphasizes claimed use of space. And it really becomes like an active participant in the interpretation and the performance of folklore. And so if the way that we understand Jewish ritual is through enactment over time by family and by environment, then photographing the body in relation to themes and motifs of Jewish story in various ways, coming to various different endings, really allows us to like infinitely engage with the folklore, to pull different meanings at different times, and to really allow the image itself to become this like narrative heirloom. And so Jewish action and these photographs that are portraying Jewish action are really cemented, not because of where they take place, but I think because of what occurs in this like photographic, ritualistic timeline. This approach and its emphasis on repetition allows for this like constant centering of the body and recentering and retranslating in different spaces and different places, even as the landscape might shift. And I think that as that sort of constant stream of interpretation is engaged, the images can position themselves in the past as memories, in the present as rituals being performed and viewed as photographs and as actions, but also in the future as stories to tell and repeat, in this like big overlapping mess of voices that I think is like very interesting and sort of keeps this project going. And so I think do I want to keep sharing my screen, Ben, with questions? Or do you want me to?
I don't think we need to share the screen immediately. I think we can just keep this conversational, but we might need to pop up to an image.
Okay. Do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, go ahead and stop sharing.
Okay.
Hannah, thank you for showing those images to us and taking us through some of these ideas. Folks, while Hannah and I are having a conversation, feel free to throw some questions into the chat, or we can open this up to the group and you can raise your hand. We are recording, so that might, if you don't want to be like, I don't know, put your voice out there. Regardless, we do want to open this up to the group. So, Hannah, I'm so curious. This title, this exhibition title, so poetic. A Permanent Home in the Mouth of the Sun. Can you talk us through how this title came about for you?
Yeah, I think that it's twofold. I guess when I was thinking about naming this sort of section of the work, because half of it is a continuation of something else, and all of it is a continuation that will be something else, and it is this kind of like weird in between space of a show that also feels very complete, which I think really speaks to like the way this work is functioning. But I was reading a lot of stories, and so I knew I wanted some kind of sentence fragment or something that felt like it was more than a title, but felt like it was more of a nod to a narrative. So it's pretty twofold, because it's talking about the literal passing of time. It's talking about the sun as marked through photography and Jewish practice, but it's also talking about diaspora, and it's talking about the promise of a changing landscape. It's talking about this idea that if no home is a set place, then the space that you find home and the space that you find consistency is through your action.
Totally. I mean, these ideas here of like permanence and memory I see them as very like fragile words also. And then, you know, I can't help but think about these ideas of like collective memory being lost, or like this idea of like memory loss, or how these images can serve as these remainders until we can't remember things anymore. I don't know if anyone in the group has had like a family member, like a experience like Alzheimer's, and just like having to like remind them of like who you are, or what experiences were had. But also the sun, and you know, this is me going into a literal space here, but the placement of natural light in your work seems like meticulously intentional, and it's visible and just on the front of almost all of your images. So I'm curious, how do you consider natural light a material or subject matter within your work, and how does it function as this reoccurring agent, not only through the title of your exhibition, but just in your work in general?
Totally. I think it's a character, I think. And because it has moods, you know, it's less of a material in the sense that it's something to project your own moods into, because it has its own. It makes known its emotions, so it becomes a sort of character in that way that I think is really interesting. And I think too that it's like, it is a vehicle that nods to making something tangible that isn't. You can't grab light out of, you know, you can't grab light coming through a window, but you can definitely feel it. And especially within a photograph, it becomes much more of like a significant presence. So it feels like a character in that way. But also like sunlight, while we're on the topic of it made so much sense to me to come to Jewish practice a little bit about a decade really after I got into photographic practice, because they're both all about time and the sun. And I feel it like smacked me in the face when I started getting into it, that it felt so obvious that both of these things were about time worship and sun worship, of this, and everything being interconnected in that way, and being sun dependent and time dependent. And so that it makes perfect sense to me that these two things are connected in this work, because in my brain they're like the same.
And it's so on the front. While we're talking about these like reoccurring themes, the artist body is another reoccurring theme within your projects. So I'm curious, can you discuss your role as the maker and a performer within your work?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a mix of myself and others. And that is to say that I don't particularly view these as self-portraits. I think that's also a character. I think it's quite performative in the way that it just kind of happens to be based in the drama of real life and reality, but I don't see them as representations necessarily of, in a more documentarian sense. I think they're quite performative. I wish there was a less negatively connotated word than performative, constructed, I guess. But and similarly, I don't use a timer when I'm making all of the self-portraits, because there's like this, I think the space between pressing the shutter and getting back into whatever positioning you're getting back into is such an interesting, unique space, where there's just a few seconds where you know that something is coming, and it's very, very potent, and it's very tangible. There's a strange tension that has always kind of existed between that, that I think would totally disappear if there was some kind of shutter release. And so it's a little bit painful, it's a little bit violent, to make self-portraits in that way, because it is a constant running back and forth, especially if something like the weather is not ideal, or I'm getting frustrated at something, or it's like, you know, just a weird body positioning or something. It is a very physical act that exists within the self-portraiture. But I think that got really emphasized during COVID, because so much of the first few years of this work was reaching out to people who really did in real life, outside of this sort of more narrative project, really did participate in the rituals and the things that are being photographed, people who really did immerse in the mikveh and wear tzitzit. And I think that's important too, that there was so much of like traveling to find people and committing to that physical action. And then when obviously that all stopped with COVID and I was kind of stuck with my own body. But that became really interesting too, because it allowed work to move a little bit slower.
Well, and going back to this idea of performing and its relationship to memory, like some rituals or some actions are unpracticed. And there's something really interesting about your work where it doesn't feel like you've done this 100 times to gear up to make the work. It feels like I can almost see you moving through it. But that you could also think about that in relation to a memory, where certain memories in a sense are unpracticed. There are memories where you want to remember things as being great. And then there are things that pop into your head and they kind of stop you for a second through this idea of like Jewish thought where, there's that shared experience. So it's interesting in terms of looking at you or watching you, in this one position through an image. There's such a before and after that I think feels like you're gearing up to get to that spot. Does that make sense?
Totally. And that almost sounds like the way that childhood memory functions, where like, even if there is this like set object or this set story that you're thinking about and you're talking about, it's not an A to B to get there. It's not an object to image relationship. It's like an object and then all of these other things happen and then some weird photo magic happens where it takes its own life on and then it becomes a photograph. And I think that that's fine. I think that when I first started the work, I was trying really hard to explain in a very concrete, cut and dry way what certain symbols meant, what certain actions meant, what a certain action stood for. And not only is that not a very Jewish way of approaching things, it's also not a very photographic way of approaching things. I think that photographs are so much more interesting when you plan all you can, but then during the actual image making, there's like 40% where you're just like, okay, whatever. We'll see what it looks like later. Definitely.
It's interesting though, this idea of like narrative coming in through your work and the narrative of the work being made, but religion, symbolism, iconography are threaded within your images. And I don't think they're threaded in a way that's quite literal. I think they really require the viewer to take some time and think about what's being what actions are happening, but what's also being presented. Can you talk a little bit more about narrative and how that's utilized in your work, or how you subvert those three themes, religion, symbolism, and iconography, to tell a story?
And they're definitely all intertwined, because it's also interesting to think about iconography and how it exists in both secular and observant worlds of Jewish practice, or how they're kind of co-opted from each other, ones that become more cultural or ones that become Yiddishkeit. Because I think that's overwhelming to first start a project with those ideas of like, oh my God, everything means everything all of the time. How am I supposed to get to something concrete? And so a natural sort of first instinct was to be very dioramic, was to be almost still life documentary and like trying to explain symbols and objects. And it felt on the nose, it felt like it was like smashed against a nose really, where like now I think that allowing for more space between, like allowing more space between this like immediate material representation of a thing or of a story or of a something, space between that thing and the photograph that's talking about that thing is really important in the work, because that space isn't empty. In this instance, like the camera is like a conduit for these sacred spaces, because it starts to manifest images that create relationships to holiness or relationships to these iconography objects or symbols or whatever, without the need for this like I'll explain concrete meaning, nose to the thing. And I go back and forth between being on the nose and being kind of vague, because I think more than anything, the photographs can serve as a guiding point to think about stories and symbols and how they can relate to something more meaningful. And I think it makes more sense to have a little bit of give and take, ones that feel a little bit more obvious so people have a set, it sets the tone a little bit. And then like these weird vague ones where people are like, what's with the dead bird?
You know, thinking, I think you mentioned like this like COVID space, but I feel like we've never needed to be reminded more than ever. Like, I feel like we've never relied on memory more than ever. Like, remember when we could go out and do things? Remember when we could be present in the world? Remember when we could even just remember enjoying a shared experience, even if it's like small and mundane? Like, when was the last time you went, you know, out and got ice cream? I haven't been on the bus in over a year, and I'm like gearing up. I'm like, today's the day I'm gonna ride the bus. And then I'm like, nah, I'll just get a ride. I've been reorganized. But those are optimistic thoughts. This idea of like here-ness, responding and trying to maintain collective memory. Does optimism, like, how does optimism function in your work? Does it exist in that, within that space? Do you think of your work as optimistic? Is, you know, as the way we think about like lineage and teaching tools, but how does optimism function for you?
Ironically.
Or does it not? It might not.
Because I think that, like, I need to explain. I think that my mindset and Jewish mindset in general is kind of like surviving for spite, and not that the work is spiteful. Like, I really do mean it. It's not spiteful work. I think it's very genuine work, but I think that the desire to like record full narratives kind of just feels like a way to not be maybe not spiraling in a black hole, but at least to, like, if you are spiraling in a black hole, it's at least to occasionally shine like a weird light into a black hole. So it's like optimism, but like it's darkened optimism, I think.
I mean, hey, like, we all need it, right? So I have one more question for you before we open this up to the group. This might require like a slide as a reference. It might not. But you write, Jewish thought suggests that memory of an action is as primary as the action itself. In other words, one wounded hand can serve as a reminder of another hand. And when I think about this idea that an experience can possibly, that an experience or possibly a shared experience can provoke a memory or move one's history closer to another, is something that calls attention to how we're organized through this idea of like a web or a connection of the past and being present. So can you take us through one of your images within your work and talk about your experience with the sitter or a subject that you've worked with and how that has triggered a specific memory of your own?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I'll share my screen again. Hang on, is it still open? Let me find my presentation, because I have a good example of that, where it's a little more like woo, like it's a little more, it takes a little bit to get there. Whereas I think like maybe like I think easier examples would be something like Shabbos candles, where, you know, you're thinking about candles as an object and then thinking about them in relation to photography, where you're thinking about sacred time, and you're thinking about not just fire, but the lack of fire, or like the presence of recent fire as signified by the smoke. And I think that that's a little more of perhaps an A to B image that relies a little bit less on the unreliable narrator that is memory. Whereas other images, I think like this bird photo, I think are a lot more intricate, but I think they function in a really similar way, where instead of immediately pointing to the Judaica being like, it came from this thing, it's a little bit more of a journey to get back to the source of that thing. Because this is thinking about a Yiddish folktale called The Bird Catcher, in which this like kid kills birds for fun, and then he falls asleep and has a dream that he's a bird and gets murdered in the same way. Spoiler alert, that's like the ending. But that is a story I read a long time ago and didn't actively think about until my parents' cat brought me this bird as a lovely gift. And so thinking about how certain memories are triggered by certain objects, I figured that would translate in a really interesting way in a photograph. So that it's kind of hard to see what's going on in this photograph, but I'm actually underneath a table. So I scooped up this bird. I was wearing gloves, scooped up this bird, placed it in such a way where it felt almost laid out in the same way that a story is explained or laid out, but it still shared that commonality of having a dead bird, and went underneath it as sort of this like obscured memory of remembrance, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Hannah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to open this up to folks in the group. Do we know, is everybody muted? Is the group able
They
to?
can unmute themselves. We have some great questions. So I'll go ahead and read through and invite whomever.
Madeline, will you monitor the chat too for questions?
Yeah, I got it.
You got this.
All right, I'll read and then I invite whoever asked the question to also unmute themselves. And this first one is from Jamie Ernest. Hi, Hannah. I love the influence of Jewish ritual and folklore within your work. I am wondering if the idea of the mundane also has any influence within your imagery, however you want to interpret the meaning of the idea of the mundane.
What's interesting about the separation from the mundane and the sacred within Jewish space is the setting sun, if you're talking about Shabbat, and actually holidays, really, because it's a lunar-ish calendar where the day starts at sunset. And that means that when the sun sets before Shabbat or before a certain holiday or before a day, before the next day, starts with the setting of the sun. And so specifically for Shabbat, I always think that's like incredibly interesting that the moment that transforms the mundane into a sacred space is this change of light, because not only is it the setting sun in the instance of Shabbat, but it's the lighting of candles. It's the human aspect of bringing light into the world as the natural light is setting. And then that is what transforms something from mundane into something sacred. And I think that idea, especially in relation to Ben's earlier question about like sunlight, I think can apply to a lot of the different images in here.
Jamie, do you have anything you want to add or respond with?
I think that was a lovely answer.
No, I think it was great. Naam, and my apologies if I'm mispronouncing the name, please feel free to correct me. Hi, I was wondering how you got started with photography and art in general. Did you study art in college? And how did you get your work out there?
I did. I'm fortunate enough that I've stumbled into it really young. I've been actively photographing for as long as I've actively remembered being a person, on old bad cameras. And so I did study both my BFA and my MFA in photography. And it's always been the center of my brain, the center of gravity, I guess, in that everything orients itself around image making. And I think that, I think that if grad school didn't make me jaded, I'm I guess I'm in this for life. I guess I really do love photography. But in terms of getting work out there, I think a lot of it is just not thinking about external factors and focusing on quality work, because those eyes find quality work, and focusing on making quality work, and then making sure to share it, but keeping those things very separate. Especially if you're a student, not sharing work right away. That's something I had to learn. And also working slowly. I think something that has changed a lot in my practice, especially with COVID, but is in general in the last 3 or 4 years, is that I used to photograph 5 times a week, and I would feel really anxious on days that I didn't. And now I think I feel a lot more comfortable with making images that matter and letting things kind of marinate for a while, letting ideas marinate for a while, making something, once a week or so, and then thinking about how I can make something better the next time.
That statement, if grad school didn't make me jaded.
Oh man.
Any follow-up? Naam?
I used to say if your eye was twitching in grad school, you weren't working. Unless your eye wasn't twitching, you weren't working hard enough.
Seriously. And I think too that once post grad school, I moved to a cottage in rural Rhode Island, and that was the absolute opposite that it possibly could have been, in the best way, where it was almost what's the Looney Tunes character where he's running off the edge of a cliff and then he just keeps going because he doesn't know he can stop. That was me when COVID simultaneously hit at the same time as me moving to this rural cottage.
Yeah, it's interesting in describing how you approach it now, because it was very similar in your conversation about setting up your images and that 40% that's kind of just chance, controlling what you can and making sure that you do that work and get that there. And then there is just part of it that is going to be opportunities and chance and luck should they arise.
Totally.
All right. Carrie, hi, Hannah. I think your work is really beautiful and brilliant. I'm curious and images like the one with the lambs and the belly. Did you set up with a story or symbols in mind when making that image? I'm just curious about your process combining all the elements that interest and attract you.
Yes, this image here, maybe should I share it again?
Right. Yeah, I was gonna say definitely, like we touched upon another image, but like this image has
bring it back.
Yeah, hold on, opening the thing here.
Bring it back.
Sorry, it like reset to showing all the things. Okay. It is, oh, it's because I opened up the other thing. Hang on. Why can't I play it? What happened in the last moment? Oh, there it is. Okay. So this is a crazy story, this picture, because I am working on another project with this person, Isabel, who's a Jewish artist who lives on a farm in Rhode Island. And we've been working together for about a year because we were connected because she was pregnant at the same time as her sheep, which is just like the most beautiful thing you can think of, and the most stressful thing you can think of, and the most cyclical thing you can think of. And I really love the process. I'm still photographing with her. All of the babies are born and all of them are healthy, which is amazing. But visiting with her and having these sort of cyclical, reflective repetitions felt so pertinent to so many of the underlying moments in this project. And even further, that this baby was born the week of Passover is just like this, which is just like very much a holiday about ideas of freedom, and ideas of like women-led walks, and like it was so definitely one of those things where you can plan so much, but there are certain magical things that exist that need to be photographed. Yeah.
Great. I'm sorry, I misread. I didn't realize it was a woman, but that makes sense now that I see the title again. But it's just the light and composition and everything is so beautiful. And then hearing your story, you know, enriches it. But I don't think the story is necessarily essential to getting, you know, the feeling of all of your work through in this one image.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and always am thinking about that too, where that's another aspect of the work that we haven't quite talked about, is that I think a lot about how it needs to be accessible to all audiences, and that it can be, the only thing I am responsible for in regards to relaying like concrete information is doing research. Like I am responsible for the amount that I read. I'm responsible for the amount of things that I learn, which is, you know, fun and a thing that I am responsible for forever, for the rest of my life. But the images themselves need to be able to function on this level of being able to almost bring down all of these sometimes really thick or sometimes really layered texts, bring them down to these very digestible motifs, and then expand them back into photographs that can stand on their own without the like long stories behind them. And I think Passover Burst is a good example of that.
Great, thanks.
From Julie Lee, we have, hi, I am in love with your work and lecture. I too am in love with your work, yeah. Your photographs seem so centered on your familiar heritage and the notion of home. One can see your work as an addition to the family archive, to your family photo albums. How do you see your photographs in relation to such familiar archives, as well as historical and societal archives? Mm-hmm. I'm curious about your views on using heirlooms and images from such archives to comment on something bigger. Julie, I'd love to hear you expand on what that something bigger is.
I know I want to pull up this question because I feel like there were a lot of parts to it. Because thinking about familiar archives, I think that there's a personal obsession and a very Jewish obsession with the documentation and perpetuation of historical documents. And I think that so much of this work got started because, not only because I was going through all of my grandmother's stuff, but the sort of missing aspect of that was that she was one of two people from that side of the family that lived from the Holocaust. She's one of two people that made it over. And that whole side is gone. There's nothing concrete to point to. And so when I think about family archives. I think about photo albums, sure, and I have them. And I have, nerdy albums of me having glasses and braces. But I think that being able to integrate my family with some of these older symbols and with some of these stories, I think makes for me, at least in my experience of understanding a family archive, more meaningful. Though I think it's both. Though I think that that's the other part of this question. In terms of historical and societal archives, I think they sort of fit into both. Thinking about second wave feminism, the personal is political, I think that really starts to apply here, where these things are precious, these objects are precious, and they can be used to further ideas and be retranslated and reinterpreted into new spaces of care depending on the current times. And I think that there's a lot of symbols that can start to take on double meanings like that, particularly within Jewish culture. They can represent being oppressed, they can represent an oppressor, they can represent happiness or sadness or both. And I think that addressing those sort of dualities or the multi-layeredness of symbology, I think, is really important to the work, both as a historical document type thing, but also just as a family archive. Whereas I think some family snapshot type photos are sometimes flat. I would like for this work to always be kind of what me and Ben were talking about, darkly optimistic.
I invite Julie to follow up, but I also have a follow up to this. It's basically some of the conversations we had in the space, because you also curated the show. You selected the works and you arranged them. Mm-hmm. And it's one thing to think about the single object functioning as the archive and the narratives that are told, then also when they're all put together up on the wall. So I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit why you arranged the works you did, or if there was a thought behind it, or it's just put it all up there.
It definitely was not put all up there. I feel I'm always rearranging this work depending on what directions it goes in. And that's an interesting process too, because there are certain images that I made in some of the earlier days of the work in 2018 where they feel so relevant now. They feel super they've stayed this whole way. Whereas some others felt more like tangents where they sort of fell off as I'm continuously kind of curating the way that I present this work. And I think that's fine. Work doesn't need to be, static and concrete in that way. But I think specifically for this show at AAP, I was thinking about works that didn't designate a specific place. And, obviously specific place in terms of geography, in terms of United States-edness, I think that being able to see that there are certain ones that are in interior and certain ones that are outside. There's a lot of Black space, there's a lot of openness. And I think that curating that around a certain amount of openness is interesting to me because I was talking about, I think that space isn't empty. It's very much filled with a lot of tension, a lot of opportunity. And so that really went into curating the works that were chosen for this specific iteration, ones that were open enough to feel like they were outreaching a hand.
If you are in the city and you have time tomorrow, go see it. Go see the show.
Thanks, Ben.
No, I think about what you're saying about space and that concept of locality or not in relation to the title, a permanent home. And that's such a specific place, but the lack of specificity within the idea of location in your work, that balance that struck between the two. All right, hi, it's Jamie again. In addition to my previous question, I'm also wondering about the idea/themes of domesticity within your work.
Mm-hmm. I think that that thread exists, and then more so themes of maternal responsibilities exist. And I think Jewishness is really interesting in that it is more of a matriarchal religion, ethnicity, culture, whatever. I think, and in the ways that it is both a blessing and a curse. And women are exempt from time-bound commandments. which is such a loaded statement in relationship to this project. So things like davening, praying at a certain time, and doing things that require you to be a certain place at a certain time are not required the same way that they're required of adult men. And I think that that's really interesting, because at some point you're thinking like, that is at a sense of freedom, but it's not a sense of freedom. It's because it is assumed that you are caretaking for others during that time. And so you can't make time to carve out for yourself to create a sacred space. And so I think that level of like thinking about domestic interiors and thinking about maternity is really interesting in this work. But I also think it's like very pro-mom. Like I don't know if I put the image of the mikvah in this presentation, but I have an image where someone is immersing in a mikvah bath. And a mikvah bath is a ritual bath where historically married Orthodox Jewish cisgender women will go and immerse after a period of nida after their period to ritually and spiritually cleanse, which is a really loaded statement. And it is interpreted by a lot of different ways by a lot of different people. You could easily roll your eyes and say, that's archaic and stupid, I'm not doing that. But I've also had women look me dead in the eyes and say, this is the most sexually empowered part of my Jewish practice. And so to include a mikvah immersion of specifically in a mikvah space where it's called Mayim Haim in Boston. They're a very inclusive, open mikvah space where anyone of any gender can immerse to mark significant periods of their life. And so, photographing my cousin immersing for her 30th birthday felt really powerful in that way, where it was not just rejecting the thing that carries a heavy connotation with domestic spaces or with motherhood, or with even just like the cis female body, but instead using that space and sort of reclaiming and recentering that space into new spaces of care and interpretation. It allows for so much more interest in history than just being able to be like, that's archaic, I'm moving on. I think it's more interesting to explore it a little bit more. I don't know if that answers that question. That was kind of meandering.
No, I think that was great. Beautiful threads of domesticity weaving themselves into this idea of maternity. It's really lovely to hear you speak about it, and we're all very honored, to hear you talk. So thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question from Kate. Hi, Hannah. You've talked a lot about how Jewish memory is passed down through generations. It is often said that trauma can be also passed down too. So my question is how your work potentially reflects the experience of your grandmother fleeing her home. Additionally, do you feel generational healing through your expression of Jewishness as an artist and a photographer?
That's such a good question, Kate. Hi, love you, Katie. I think that it would be more optimistic, speaking of optimism, to say that the work is healing because it's focusing on time rather than space. And that exists. I think that that's very true. And then there's also this like facet of the work that exists this way because there's really no home to return to. There was no home for my grandmother to return to. My parents just sold our childhood home. There's a lot of change is the only constant, I think. And there's definitely trauma that gets passed down and in an epigenetic sense, sure, but also really just in the way that what you emphasize within your family structures. And I think that because this work was based so much in family, that naturally translates to the way that it's being photographed. And so it is like clinging on to the space that it occupies with one hand, but that hand is kind of like over here, whereas the ritualistic practice of it is closer to the heart. So maybe it is a little healing for me to make the work and to talk to people when I'm photographing them. Oh yeah, and I think one other thing to mention too is that I have a silencer on my camera. So the shutter doesn't go off when I'm photographing, it's just silent. And I think that makes such a big difference because it really like lets the camera immerse into the space with the rest of the things that are going on. And I think that aspect of it is really healing.
Everyone's gonna go home and silence their cameras now.
Thank you for your thoughtful response, Hannah. I love you too.
Any more questions? Feel free to type in the chat and mute yourself. Ben, I don't know if you have any more questions after these ones, that anything was triggered in your mind as some of these great questions came up.
No, I'm thoroughly spent and have enjoyed everyone's questions.
Me too. These were all really thoughtful.
Yeah, and the work is great. As Ben mentioned, tomorrow is the last day. We are open 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. Down at 143rd Street in Lawrenceville. So come on over. If you come on over late, you can maybe get a drink afterwards or grab lunch somewhere along Butler Street, and we'd love to have you. So thank you, everyone. I don't know if Ben or Hannah, if you have any other parting words, but.
No, thanks so much for having me. It was really great to have this work in this beautiful space.
Yeah, Hannah, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Hope to see you soon, Ben.
I know.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your evening.